Shores of Minneapolis. My name's Catherine Shreves. I'll be your host tonight. Doris Baylor's away, but she will be doing a special show on voting on Martin Luther King Day. So this evening we have with us John Gordon, who's the Executive Director of the ACLU of Minnesota, better known as ACLU, American Civil Liberties Union of Minnesota. Before joining the ACLU several years ago, John had a long career in civil litigation at Faegre Baker Daniels. He served as an adjunct professor at the University of Minnesota and St. Thomas Schools of Law. So welcome and thank you for taking the time to be with us tonight. So why don't you start out by telling us a little bit about the ACLU?
Catherine, first of all, let me say thank you, and what a great privilege it is to be here and to have a chance to visit with you on this show, and particularly to talk about the ACLU, which is the oldest and largest and most successful and strongest legal advocacy organization in the country, protecting people's civil rights and civil liberties for everybody in the United States, and we're very proud of that. We're very proud of the record of this organization, which has been in existence for 100 years, and which has been protecting free speech, freedom of religion, has been fighting for racial justice, has been fighting for due process, and has been involved in some of the major Supreme Court battles and battles throughout the court system in this country. So it's a great pleasure to be here.
Wonderful. So I think we should start out to talk about your campaign for smart justice and what that is. It's an effort, I think, to reduce jail and prison population, but why don't you tell us a little bit about that and why it's come to be a big project of the ACLU?
We are really excited about the Campaign for Smart Justice. It's a nationwide program that we here in Minnesota are a part of. The American Civil Liberties Union of Minnesota is one of the state affiliates of the national ACLU, and the national ACLU has put together and helped us put together in each of the states a blueprint, and there's a blueprint for each one of the 50 states in the Union and the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico, where we also have an affiliate, to, as you said, reduce the incarcerated population in this country by 50%. So that's a big goal. That's a big reach. The United States has got about 5% of the world's population and about 25% of all the prisoners in the world. Wow. So that's nothing particularly to be proud of. Yeah. And it's baked into the culture of this country. It's got its roots really in slavery and in the racism that we've suffered with in this country. And we are still feeling the effects of that today. So the Campaign for Smart Justice is an effort to try to reverse the trend toward increasing incarceration. And it's true across the United States and especially in Minnesota. We pride ourselves in Minnesota as being very humane, et cetera. And over the last 16 or so years, the U.S. imprisonment rate has actually gone down very slightly, but in Minnesota, the incarceration rate has gone up 51% in a period of just a decade and a half, which is really quite shocking.
And what do you attribute that to?
It is a problem that arises really at every stage of the legal system and the law enforcement system. So you've got a school to prison pipeline, which has injected into the schools a law enforcement mentality as opposed to a best interest of the student mentality. You've got the number of crimes that are increasing and the length of the sentences that are increasing. You've got a system where each of the 87 counties in Minnesota has got its own elected county attorney, and so that's subject to the political winds, and there are not many county attorneys and candidates for county attorney who are running on platforms of let's do less law enforcement, which is the way it's read sometimes, and there can be a battle for who can be the toughest on crime. And so that's a problem. And then a big problem that we've got in Minnesota and elsewhere is the fact that there are a lot of people on supervised release and probation but so many of them go back to jail not for committing new crimes, but for committing technical violations of their probation. So of all the jail admissions, and there are 2 out of every 5 of them that are returns from supervision. In other words, 2 out of every 5 are folks who have been on supervised release, who have been on probation already for another crime, and they go back to jail. 88%, nearly 9 out of every 10 of those, are folks who have been accused of or found to have violated the technical terms of their probation. They're not going back to jail because they committed another crime when they were on probation. That's not the reason for it. The reason is they don't report in, they fail to go to a meeting, they fail to call in, they fail to fill out a form, they fail to submit something on time, and they get reincarcerated.
So that's the technical violation, not checking in with your parole officer, or?
That's an example of it, yeah.
Okay.
And people should follow the terms of their probation. But you know, those of us who live in comfortable circumstances say, well, you know, if your job is to go across town and show up at a meeting, what's the problem with that? Well, you know, that may not be much of a problem for you or for me or for a lot of folks. But if you are in poverty, if you can't afford a $400 car repair, which is true for more than half the people in this country, if you've got a babysitter that doesn't show up to take care of your kids, if you've got something broken in your house that's keeping you there, if you've got these things going on in your life, and so many of these these folks have got so many different problems that are preventing them from really, I think you'd say, getting control of their lives. It's easy enough to say, well, how come you can't just show up at a meeting? And the answer is, it's a lot more difficult for some people than it is for others.
So that would send you back to prison even though you hadn't committed a new crime?
Absolutely.
That's crazy.
It is crazy, and it is counterproductive because, of course, you are splitting up families. You are then causing people to lose their jobs. You are imposing a huge burden on the court system. You're imposing a huge burden on the police. You're imposing a huge burden on jails and prisons. It's nuts.
So one of the things that I think I read on your website had to do with some of the ways, recommendations that you thought would help reduce mass incarceration. And so one was getting rid of cash bail. Explain what its role is in full legalization of marijuana. Talk about some of those things that.
Sure, it's basically there's really a 4-pronged approach. There's at least that, but there's 4 major ones that are worth emphasizing. One is not reincarcerating people, and I don't mean to use fancy terminology, but not throwing people back in jail for failure to fill out a form, failure to show up at a meeting, another what we would call technical violations. There are people who need support for this, there are people who need counseling, there are people who need education. Throwing them back in jail doesn't do anything but create a downward spiral for people. And the more you're in jail, the more then you go back on probation, then you end up making a mistake, you go back in jail, probation, mistake, and it just goes on, and it affects not just the person, but it affects their family, it affects their employer, it affects their neighborhood. You've got empty houses where there ought to be people living, and instead one or more folks are in jail, and so it spirals downward like that. So there ought to be other kinds of enforcement mechanisms other than just the knee-jerk reaction, okay, we're going to throw them back in jail. So that's one of the 4 methods that we think that will help. The other thing, of course, is the longer that you're on probation, the longer it is that you've got a chance to make a mistake and end up back in jail. Statistics show that nearly all of the serious probation violations occur in the first months or maybe the first year max of a probationary term. But people can be on probation, and this comes into play in another one of the cases that I hope we'll get a chance to talk about. People can be in jail, on probation in Minnesota for up to 40 years. So I ask you rhetorically, what are the chances that somebody's going to make a mistake in terms of technical compliance over a 40-year period?
Hi. Okay, so that leads us to Schroeder versus Minnesota, which is the case where the ACLU has sued the Secretary of State only because of his position as the Secretary of State. And you've sued on behalf of the people of Minnesota with felony convictions who are barred from voting even while they're on supervision or probation. So tell us a little bit about that and explain too why it had to be a legal question, why the legislature wouldn't handle this politically.
It's a great question. And it's a multi-pronged, it's kind of a multi-pronged question. I'll give you a multi-pronged answer. Okay. One of the ways that we operate at the ACLU of Minnesota is what we call integrated advocacy. So we've got advocacy in the courts, the lawsuits that we've been talking about. We've got advocacy at the legislature. So we have a lobbying team at the legislature to work with legislators to oppose the legislation that is harmful to civil liberties, promote the legislation that helps civil liberties. And then we have a community engagement group that is out literally on the streets, knocking on doors, having events, raising public awareness, getting people to know their rights, and the sort of educational activity that goes on. So the Schroeder case is a great example of a piece of the integrated advocacy around Restore the Vote. The Minnesota Constitution says that voting is a fundamental right. It's one of the most important rights that we've got under the Constitution. That's true under the federal Constitution and the Minnesota Constitution. And that even if you've been in jail or imprisoned, you ought to be able to vote when you get out once you've been, quote unquote, restored to civil rights. So the question is, what does that mean, restored to civil rights? The Minnesota legislature, many years ago, passed a law that said restored to civil rights means not when you get out of jail or out of prison. It means when your term of probation or supervised release is over. And so that can be for a short period of time, or, as I said, it can be up to 40 years. Jennifer Schroeder, who's the first named plaintiff in our lawsuit, committed a drug offense when she was a young woman, served 365 days in a county jail, never in prison, and had tacked on to the end of that jail term 40 years of probation. That means that unless this problem is solved, she is not going to be able to vote again until the year 2053, when she is 71 years old, will be her next opportunity to vote. She, like a lot of other folks, and like the other three plaintiffs in our lawsuit, are living in their community. They are working. Jennifer is a drug counselor in particular, and has had a wonderful career in that field since ending her term of incarceration. She and other plaintiffs, other folks, have families. They are working in our communities. They are earning money. They are spending money. They are paying taxes. They are raising their children. They've got their kids in school. They are volunteering. They are community activists. They are worshiping in the communities, but they are still under court supervision, and therefore, according to the statute, which we think is unconstitutional, cannot vote, even though we've said, okay, you're out of jail now, go back and have a good life, except we throw barriers in front of people, housing barriers, job barriers, and the barrier of not being able to vote. And so we've, on the one hand, said, welcome back to society, and on the other hand, we say, yeah, but not really.
Interesting. And I think that we read a lot about Florida in the last few elections, because it seemed like that state, more than many states, had a lot of people who couldn't vote. A lot of African American men couldn't vote.
Right. Were millions of folks that were re-enfranchised. Again, the term franchise meaning to vote. The situation in Florida was even worse than it was in Minnesota, and so the constitutional amendment that got approved in Florida brought Florida up from its very low level of participation, that is, it's even more harsh disenfranchisement, up to where Minnesota is now, in rough terms. Okay. So it was even worse there. They are now where we are now, but we want to get to the next level. We're working with a wonderful team of lawyers from Faegre Baker Daniels, as a matter of fact, to convince the court before the next election, as we hope we will do, that it is irrational and a lack of due process, a lack of equal protection to forbid people from voting while they are on probation, even though they're back in the community, as I say, raising families, earning money, paying taxes.
So do you expect this to be decided before the fall of 2020?
Yes, we do. We are
Great.
Very hopeful that we will get a decision from the court that has two characteristics. One, that it'll be a good decision, and two, that it'll be a quick decision.
Excellent. Well, okay, so let's move on to another court case that you have filed in Worthington. And why don't you tell us a little bit about that case? Okay,
there's one of the cases that we've got in Worthington involves a young man named Kelvin Rodriguez, who is a Latino gentleman from Iowa. He was in Worthington one night. He pulled into a used car lot, basically in front of a police car, and was chased by the police and beat up, is the only way to say it. I mean, severely damaged by the occupants of the police car, who were not just police officers, as it turns out, but one of the folks involved in it was just a buddy of one of the police officers, a ride-along, as they call it. So it's a police violence case, but it's not just a police violence case. It's a friend of the police violence case. They did great damage to this young man. They fractured several ribs. They lacerated liver and pancreas and several organs. It was so bad that he had to be airlifted from Worthington to an emergency room in South Dakota. Had several operations. Had over $150,000 in medical expenses for the crime of being scared by the police. Because the problem was, frankly, he saw the police, he was scared, he was afraid he was going to get hurt. You know, he was right. And it's just a vicious situation. And it's a situation that has recurred in Worthington. We have represented other folks in Worthington who've had remarkably similar encounters with members of the Worthington Police Department. And so we view that as a real problem.
That's terrible.
It's ghastly, and you can see videos. Actually, you can see videos of two of these incidents on our website, if you'll forgive the plug, at aclumn.org.
Absolutely.
And it is just chilling to watch these videos, and they are from the squad car dash cams.
This was taped.
Absolutely.
Okay, so you have another case. Is it Esperanza?
Esparza versus Nobles County. We are really excited about this case. It's a class action. I want to say that in the Rodriguez case, we're working with some wonderful lawyers at Robbins Kaplan. In the Esparza case, we're working with a great team from Anthony Osland law firm, and that's a class action to, this sounds funny, and I'm going to explain it this way because it's true, to get an order from the court to order the sheriff of Nobles County to follow state law. You wouldn't think that was very controversial, I don't think. But in Nobles County, the sheriff claims the ability to hold on to folks for immigration officials till the immigration officials can come by and scoop them up for immigration violation purposes or alleged immigration violation purposes, longer than state law allows him to. He basically claims to be an agent of the federal government for the enforcement of federal law, whereas I think all of us would agree that when we have state and county officials in the state of Minnesota, they should be working on state laws and following the state rules.
Right.
And And the claim by the other side in this case is that they don't have to follow the state rules because they can basically deputize themselves as junior immigration officers. We've started a class action, so a class action meaning with the name of a particular individual, but on behalf of folks similarly situated. And we've gotten this lawsuit started. The judge down there was so appalled by this behavior that rather than even waiting for a full trial after all the evidence in the case is in, has entered a temporary injunction stopping this practice while the case is going on. So there is an order against Nobles County to require them to follow the law while the case is going on, even though there hasn't been a final determination. So we are very optimistic, cautiously optimistic, because you don't want to presume anything, but we are hopeful that this judge will stick with his current position and say that on a permanent basis, Nobles County needs to follow the law.
Wow. Okay. So, and this sheriff, I'm guessing, is an elected official.
Correct.
So up for election in 2020?
I
wonder.
actually don't know the answer to that question.
That is not important. When I'm thinking when somebody's an elected official, when they're, I'm assuming that will be a political issue
on a regular basis.
For him.
The question is, when does the term start and stop?
Right.
And I can't answer that question.
Yeah, that doesn't matter. So let's see. Tell us about some of the other projects that the ACLU of Minnesota is working on.
One of the things I love about the ACLU is that while we are very focused on litigation, we have a very strong litigation team, as I said, just examples in these cases, folks from Faegre, folks from Robbins, folks from Anthony Oslin. We have a very strong internal legal team, and we are working on representing immigrants. We're working on representing people who are incarcerated. We're working on all manner of issues involving litigated rights. We also have a very strong team at the legislature, and we have a legislative session starting up very shortly, and we're going to be over there, even though it's a short session and is not supposed to be unduly policy oriented. You just never know what's going to pop up, and so we've got our team over there. We want to make sure that we create a lot of opportunities for people to get involved. So if you go onto our website, aclumn.org, you can see the details for Lobby Day. And so we have a day ordinarily every session, and we're going to do that, where we gather in the rotunda of the state capitol. We have a few speeches, short speeches, and then we have teams of folks go out and visit their own legislators. I think one of the things that is that not everybody understands is how accessible their legislators are to them. It's a long way to Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. gets a lot of ink spilled over it. But there is a lot of action at the state legislature in voting rights, in criminal justice, in racial justice, in all manner of topics. And you can go over there really anytime you want to and find your legislator's office, go in there, and unless they're in session or in the middle of something or in a meeting or whatever, very frequently, you can literally go up to their assistant and say, I'm a constituent, I live in so-and-so's district, I'd like to talk to her, or I'd like to talk to him, and you can do that. We organize a particular lobby day where everybody kind of goes over there in force. We have ACLU t-shirts, and we spread out all over the Capitol and make sure that the members of the legislature know that we are there and we are watching them.
What day is your lobby day this year?
It is on the website.
Okay.
I want to drive people to the website if I can to make sure that they get all the details in terms of time and logistics.
Wonderful, wonderful. I think I was at your breakfast a year ago, and I heard a couple of different people speaking. One of them was a young woman I think a young Latina woman who had had a traffic stop. No, she'd been rear-ended by someone.
She had been rear-ended. Miriam Parada is a wonderful young woman. She was a student. She was taking her younger siblings to an appointment. She was rear-ended at an intersection. Police were called by the person who did the rear-ending. The offender was let go, and the police were dissatisfied with Miriam's identification, even though she really did have a legitimate ID card. They hauled her to jail, and they basically stalled long enough that when they called the immigration authorities, the immigration folks came over and incarcerated her, separated her from her family, terrified all of them, and have put her in deportation proceedings.
So this is the work of the ACLU.
This is an example.
This is some of the work of the ACLU. It's mass incarceration. It's treating people non-violently when they're arrested. It's keeping people from being deported wrongly. I mean, it's all good work.
Well, we appreciate that. The work has changed so significantly. We are still doing an enormous amount of work in freedom of religion, freedom of speech. We established the principle that people have a constitutional right to video what's going on in police encounters. They have a right to protest in public ways. So we've represented somebody successfully who was protesting on I-94 after the Philando Castile shooting, and there was one gentleman who wouldn't plead to a lesser offense, who insisted on protecting his rights to protest under the First Amendment, and we were successful, and our cooperating lawyer Howard Bass was successful in representing him. We're very proud of that. Even things like where people can sit in city council meetings when city councils don't like to hear from them. So we're doing a lot of very basic free speech work of the type that the ACLU has been doing literally for 70 years in the state of Minnesota and 100 years in the United States.
For a century.
Indeed.
Well, thank you for coming this evening. John Gordon, our guest. This is Catherine Shreves. Thank you for tuning in to We the People, brought to you by the League of Women Voters of Minneapolis. We hope you join us again. Good night.